Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and I throw around a lot of jargon terms. And I've gotten a few requests now to do an explainer, to do a glossary. So I'm going to go through everything, sort of all the terms I use in these videos, but then also all the kind of references and resources that are out there for this game that I'll talk about sometimes, but I've never put a video to kind of put the entire catalog together of everything. You know, this will go to everything that'll make your games go faster, everything that's going to make theory crafting easier, all of that. Let's get them all into one video, and then so every slang term, every tactical reference, all of that. But first, news. So a bunch of Underworld's warbands, I think the first 24 of them, all went on last chance to buy. So they're all going to be leaving the Games Workshop store coming soon. Now, whether that's leaving forever or sort of being put on some sort of rotation is sort of anybody's guess. I've heard some people talk about it as if it's, you know, something that just kind of rotates in and out. Either way, this is pretty unfortunate for Warcry fans, of course, you know, a bit of a slap in the face. Unless they get repackaged in some way. The only reason to hope for that, right, is that we're going to get a Warcry preview Friday, May 6th. So that's coming up pretty soon here in just about a week, probably, when this video comes out. This could be connected, right? It does seem like a really easy coincidence to me that these are coming off of the store right before there's a Warcry preview. There's some reasons to think that maybe the future of Warcry and Underworlds will be a little bit closer enmeshed than they have been in the past, right? When they hired staff to work on Warcry, it was to work on Warcry and Underworlds. Like, the departments are the same department. So I think that that's interesting as guesswork for what we'll see on that preview. Other possibilities are another dual box. I think that they're pretty comfortable with their formula now of, you know, they'll do it in other games too, even the big games. This isn't that different from the quote-unquote FOMO boxes, but this actually offers something, right, with what Kill Team does, you know, doing 2 warbands, probably both bespoke warbands, and also just like some terrain with some crazy rules. If that happens, if that's the case, you know, I'm kind of putting that out there as something that's sort of predictable and unexciting, but I will be excited to see it when it comes out, and I'll definitely be pretty hyped about it. So regardless of what we see, I'll definitely report about it the weekend afterwards. Do we dare say 2.0? I would say not. I don't think Warcry is big enough that if it was Warcry 2.0, it would get its own day. I don't think it would. However, being there with 2 different systems on the same day, and also the fact that it wasn't mentioned in the video, but it is in the, like, it's in the schedule, but not on the video, to me says it's going to be something small. You know, could just be Dark Oath and Tarantulos getting packed into their own boxes, plus just one thing small. Could be something big with the Underworld's warbands that are still out there, right? It just seems so weird to me that they would give them all rules. They also have AOS rules, and then they would get rid of them on the store. You know, they've shown a willingness to keep, you know, garbage Cities of Sigmar units that nobody buys on the store in perpetuity, right? So it just seems odd to me that they would get rid of Underworlds without putting it somewhere, and so I wouldn't be surprised to see it here. Yeah, a lot of different things. I think it's going to be something small, but definitely going to be worth talking about regardless. So now let's get into the meat of our video. The first thing I want to talk about is wargaming terms that I use in Warcry, that in my videos I kind of adapt to Warcry. The first of which is just hammer. It's something that you'll hear sort of AOS YouTubers use all the time. Just an offensive unit that's great at killing chaff, deals significant damage to non-chaff too, just really great offensive, and usually something pretty big, like a significant piece of your force that's out there doing a ton of damage. Hammers also, you know, best if they're mobile. If sort of a slow hammer, they exist, you can play them, but it has a lot of disadvantages that you usually want to avoid. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about hammers. Anvils, or the opposite of that, is in my mind it's a defensive unit that isn't expendable, right? So you expect it to go up against a hammer and maybe last multiple rounds and maybe even win, right? Something like Kurnoth Hunters are a really good example of an anvil in Warcry. These terms come from a real military tactic, and I'm not using them exactly the way they exist in that military tactic. You can go, you can Wikipedia it. I know just enough about it to say something that's like extra wrong than if I knew nothing about it. You know what I mean? So I'm not going to just sort of give you the whole military history of how they've been used. I'm mostly just focusing on how they're going to be used, how I've used them in these videos and how I'll continue to going forward. I also want to talk about chaff. Chaff is another thing you see in almost every war game. Just cheap, expendable units that can make up the backbone of your force. At least in Warcry, it'll often be the backbone of your warband, but sometimes you'll just see sort of 3 of them, 1 in each deployment group. Chaff can be fast, it can be killy, it can be sort of board flood. Board flood being when your warband is mostly made of chaff. When I use killy, right, it's just chaff that does a lot of damage point for point, stuff like that. Defensive chaff, a lot of people will call a tar pit. So if you hear that kind of bandied about, that's what they mean, is just expendable, low-cost units that are surprisingly resilient when you get into them. That would be tar pit. Foot slogging is something that I say sometimes, and you see a lot in, you see it more in the RTS community, actually, I think, but it's just a warband or a deployment group or just like a good piece of your crew where all of the members are just kind of on basic infantry movement speed, no flying characteristic, and they're just slowly moving around the board in a way that, they call it foot slogging because it feels like a slog. It's a little bit rough getting from place to place, but can still be functional sometimes. A few others that I use quite a bit is, one is NPE, which stands for negative play experience. A few examples of this, right? Like pre-Tome of Champions, Seraphon or KO gun lines could do this, where it's like they kind of shoot you off the board without you ever feeling like you played a game, right? Because Seraphon literally don't move, they'll just stand there and every single skink will shoot. Another one is swarm factions on any of the early base game, like 3-round objective missions, where, you swarm something with Aether Wings back in the day, and like your opponent never really got to do anything because the Aether Wings were on the objectives, winning all the points, and always running away and trying to avoid you. And so just like it was like a non-game that you just lose on points immediately. Half the twists in the base game are like major NPE. Just they immediately ruin the game as soon as you draw them. It's a big reason why I made my twist video, to try to kind of steer people towards the good twists. Check out that twist video if you've ever had this kind of twist problem and you want that. So I'll link that down below. Bubble wrap is another term that I'll use sometimes. It's a type of screen. A screen is just any time when you place a fighter where they prevent the opponent from accessing an important target, whether that's they're in the way of your soft sort of damage dealer, or they're in the way of a objective, something like that. Bubble wrap is when I fully surround an important target with usually chaff units, something like that, so that there's no path anywhere from it, right? So it's not just a screen, but it's like a fully surrounding screen, something like that. And then, my important target will just kind of travel with the chaff units around it over the course of a few rounds. All right, so let's get into some terms that I've either made up for Warcry or or other folks have made up specifically for the game that I use a lot. So the first is dragon, and this is probably the most important and also most confusing one, because there are no actual dragons in Warcry. They're too big for the game. But any flyer with move 8 or more, and the flight keyword, and sort of game-defining combat stats. So a flyer that can kind of bend the game around it, whether it can sort of kill chaff units in one hit, or whether it's just very hard to kill and deals respectable damage. Anything like that, I just call them dragons because their effect on the game is the same that a dragon would have relative to everything else, right? They fly around, they go wherever they want, and then they generally win the fight when they get there. I don't currently make any distinction in that term between sort of the defensive dragons, like say a Crypt Flayer, or the offensive dragons, like say a Squig Hopper boss. Maybe one day I'll need to make something up for that, but for the most part I don't. Same is true for the 2-inch reach flyers with less incredible combat stats, but really good utility. I tend not to call them dragons, but they are sort of in their own sort of unique league, and they are really good generally. So this is like the Sylvaneth Arch Revenant or the Krajan Overlord's Custodian. Those are really solid, and you could call them dragons. You could kind of put them in their own category. If you think of a category for these 2-inch reach flyers, let me know. I'll just put it in the comments down below. But for now, any of these 1-inch reach, incredibly frightening mobile pieces, I just call them all dragons. Titans. When I call something a Titan, I don't use this very often, but really refers to any foot slogging fighter with just absolutely mind-blowing combat stats. It has to be just absurd. It needs to be able to beat most, or at least any similar pointed dragon in a fight, and it needs to be able to clear chaff in one hit in order to qualify. Both those things need to be true. So something like a Doom Bull or a Storm Fiend qualify. An Ogre Tyrant qualifies, right? Most of the Ogre melee leaders qualify for this. The best Stormcast leaders qualify for this, but there's a lot of fake Titans in the game. A lot of things in the game that are pointed like these really powerful units, but just don't do their jobs, either don't beat dragons in a fight, don't kill chaff very effectively, just generally aren't very good. There's a ton of them in the game. The Ogre Breacher, 90% of the Stormcast leaders, just a whole bunch of them. You could go on and on. There's also kind of a slightly different thing of the board control Titans, like the Wrathmaster or the Kurnoth Huntmaster with 2-inch reach. So these are ones where once you have them in place, because of that 2-inch reach, they just have this massive pie plate of the board that they just own, basically, that nobody can really go to without having to deal with them. And those are really good. You don't generally see slow, expensive pieces dominating in Warcry, but the 2-inch reach ones can kind of make up for that because of their incredible capabilities when they get there. I also sometimes talk about a no-fly zone, almost entirely based on dragons versus titans. Basically, the no-fly zone is the area around a titan where dragons can't land without exposing themselves and potentially getting blown up. So kind of two intertwining terms there, creating a third one. Some other things, so artillery is of course a word that's used in other wargaming, but I use it differently in Warcry. I use it to just talk about any really expensive ranged fighter that does massive damage per activation. Something like a Thunder Fist or a Judicator with the Thunderbolt crossbow. This is another one where there's just a lot of false artillery in the game where they are very expensive, but they don't actually do a lot of damage when you average it out. Things like the Long Strike Raptor Prime is just a really garbage ranged unit. There's quite a few. I feel like the rules writers used a lot of range attacks to almost as kind of skill testers to see if people would actually math out the damage, because there's a lot with range profiles that look really appealing and are actually really terrible. You see that a lot in the game. But yeah. So the ones that actually do their job, I call them artillery pieces, because they basically just stand still and blow something off the floor every turn or every round. Gunline is a different sort of ranged warband sort of structure where it's just any group of cheaper fighters that all attack from range. I call that a gunline because, they're just all lined up and they all have guns. You have a few factions in Warcry that can sort of build these types of war bands. Tzeentch can do it. KO can do it. Seraphon can do it. Cities of Sigmar can do it. There's a few. They range pretty wildly in effectiveness. The Midsize trap, I'm not going to spend another video sort of going over it a whole bunch, but it's just an artifact of the game mechanics that makes it difficult for fighters with kind of mid-size point costs to make an impact on the board. So, you know, there's a lot of these fighters. Most of the fighters in the game are actually these mid-size fighters, and most of the fighters in the game don't really make much of an impact, you know, point for point or fighter for fighter. So it's just something you'll hear me refer to, and that's what it is. You can see my Lessons from Adepticon video for kind of more on that. I've got a few other videos that talk about it too. The How to Make a Solid Warcry List video also talks about that. Hopefully I'm linking those down below and remembering that. Mage is another thing I talk about, another thing that you see in lots of video games. In Warcry, a mage is it's a class of fighters. They're very similar, like more than half, 3/4 of the warbands in the game have one of these fighters with a really similar 7-inch range attack, deals 3 damage on a hit, 6 on a crit, but it almost always misses. They almost always have a dice ability and the Mystic Rune Mark. It's usually said in a derogatory way because almost all the mages in Warcry are completely unplayable. They've kind of changed that with recent releases. I think someone on the rules team has realized that mages are completely unplayable in Warcry, and they have kind of pushed the more recent ones a little bit harder. The Knight Arcanum, I think, is the name of it. The mage that comes in the Dominion box. That one's a lot better than I think a lot of the previous ones were. The mage that comes in the Red Harvest box, the Dark Oath one, is a little bit better than some of the old ones. Basically, the issue with them is that magic attack, that 7-inch range attack, doesn't go very far, and it basically always misses every time. And so, you know, it then goes entirely on how good the ability is. And to be honest, most mage abilities aren't any better than just your average leader ability that every leader in every faction gets. So that just ends up meaning that mages don't do anything. So don't play them. I do expect future mages to be a lot better. Some more. We got lots of these. These are all kind of based on sort of shorthand terms for abilities. The first one being pull. When I say something has a pull ability, it just means that most of these are either a double or a triple, but it's a disruptive ability that forcibly moves an opposing fighter around on the board, whether it's sort of pushing them out, or usually it's pulling them towards you, which is why I call it pull. A lot of fighters with like harpoons will have this, but sometimes you'll see something where it's flavored as sort of a spell that's being cast, like with the Khorne Slaughter Priest. It's sort of a ability that it has on your mind or something. I don't know. The flavor is often pretty weird with them, but anything that kind of forces a fighter to move. And generally these abilities are pretty good. Nets. This is one that I've talked about a lot, but you'll hear me talk about, I think, even more in the future, because the Tome of Champions has made net abilities really incredible. But it's a disruptive ability, you know, like a pull in that way, but instead of forcing a fighter to move, it prevents a unit from moving. Or sometimes from activating altogether. So there's a few net abilities, like, say, the Contorted Epitomes, that will actually cause a fighter to skip their turn. You know, the net abilities are worded really differently based on which fighter has them. All of them are really good, but there's different shades of just how good. AoE, or as you'll hear some folks call it, the party buff. Basically, AoE stands for area of effect. I'll use it to talk about nerfs, AoE nerfs, or AoE buffs. An AoE nerf is anything that weakens enemy units within a certain radius. An AoE buff is anything that strengthens ally units within that radius. There's a lot of sort of generally tricksy seeming fighters in the game that have these AoE abilities, and some of them are pretty good. Some more, because here we go. So activation wars. In round one, the player with more fighters is often in the driver's seat. And so that's what I talk about with activation wars, where if you just have more fighters on the board, you have more activations, and that puts you in the driver's seat as far as revealing your strategy to your opponent, being able to react to your opponent's strategy, all of that. All of that is just kind of whoever has the most fighters can waste activations before using their really important activations, and kind of force their opponent to commit. And that can often determine who is winning at the end of round one, is just who has the most fighters. Much less important in later rounds than it is in the first round, but yeah, something to always be thinking about in the game and something I talk about a lot. Sometimes you'll hear me refer to a bobsled track. That's specifically a piece of terrain in Red Harvest that just really heavily dictates how games play out. Wherever the bobsled track is on the board in Red Harvest games will just sort of completely decide the game. Not completely decide the game, because usually the warbands still are the ones fighting it, but it will have a major effect on what the strategy has to be. Whenever I say the word dungeons, I'm referring to Catacombs games. So usually it's in reference to the fact that what's good in the dungeon, quote, is really different than what's good, quote, above ground, because Catacombs just favors completely different warband construction than the rest of the game does. Hunter missions. So I've talked about in a few videos sort of the different types of missions that are in Warcry. The one where the name isn't self-explanatory is what I call hunter missions. So any mission where the win condition is to get a kill against your opponent and prevent your opponent from getting the same kill against you. So I think the best example and my favorite hunter mission is Bloodmarked, where you have one quote-unquote blood-marked unit where you can't let your opponent kill your blood-marked unit, and you have to find a way to kill your opponent's blood-marked unit. It's an amazing mission, but that's essentially what I mean by a hunter mission, where you have to hunt down a certain deployment group, a certain fighter, something like that. Anytime I talk about charging in this game, it's not in the way of charging something up like a lot of video games will have. It's more any activation spent using move then attack is like you're charging towards someone to fight them. So anything where you're just moving into your threat range for an opponent and then attacking them, I would call a charge. Kind of the flip side of that, I'll often talk about reprisal. That's just the concept that a unit that hasn't activated yet can respond to a charge with a double attack, right? Because you get two parts of your activation. You can go attack, attack. So if they move and then attack you, you get to then attack them twice back. And so the charging unit is sort of at a disadvantage there, unless they have abilities that sort of favor them for having charged, which a lot of cavalry do have that kind of decent triple that does that. So that's what I mean with reprisal. It's more of just kind of a game concept that just means that kind of the reactive fighter is at an advantage. This is basically, reprisal is why the activation wars exist, right? Because you want to be committing your most important pieces after your opponent has committed their most important pieces in round one. And all of that is just because of this concept of reprisal. One last one is magic references. It's the thing that a third of you really love, a third of you absolutely go livid with rage about, and the last third are looking around in the comments like, why is everyone so excited or mad? So let's get into resources. These are things that are going to help you play the game of Warcry. Most of them don't come from GW. Most of them are fan-made. There's a great community around this game. And the first one I want to talk about is Stats Hammer. So this is a website where you can enter in the fighter's kind of base attack profile, and it will spit out a ton of really, really useful metrics for you. So you'll get average damage against every toughness that's relevant, and it'll do both cumulative and discrete probabilities against every toughness. So when I mean cumulative probability, I mean the likelihood of doing at least a certain amount of damage. So the picture I've got here, right, is T4 of a Thunder Prime, which is what I would call a Thundercat Prime. Probably should define Thundercats. I'll sprinkle that up on the board here. But here we've got the cumulative probability being the likelihood that they do less than or equal to a certain damage amount. And so if you want your odds of taking something out that has that much life left, you just do 1 minus that probability, right? They'll also show you average damage stuff, and it's just really amazing. If you're ever kind of wanting to compare two fighters, this is the perfect website to do it with, because it's really important not just to know average damage, but to know, for example, how swingy a fighter's damage profile is. Something like the probability that you just do nothing to a fighter, right? That's really important. All of that is just really interesting, really important, and this website is really incredible. Everyone should check it out. Another really important resource is BattleScribe. It's an amazing list building app. It's one of the few sort of Warhammer at large apps, sort of, because it's really big in 40K, it's decently big in AOS. It's one of the very few sort of apps for the whole community that's actually just as good for Warcry as it is for 40K. These are really rare, like Wahapedia doesn't mess with Warcry, for example. The folks running the Warcry section of this app like really care about this game, and it's really cool to see. So basically, just never use Varinscribe. If you haven't heard of Varinscribe, that's great. It's the GW official list building resource. It's often out of date, usually out of date, has odd readability issues, just has a ton of problems with it. So if you're going to make your own lists, make your own spreadsheet, use the Warband printouts that come with the books, right? Use BattleScribe, but just never use Varinscribe, please. The compendium, we don't talk about the compendium. The first rule of the compendium is not to talk about it. I'm breaking it now. It's amazing. Redacted, you're great for making it. I've already said too much. Resources. By the way, just the reason that I don't want to talk about it too much on the video is the owner of it has sort of expressed some reticence about making it, or like giving the link out publicly, just because I think they're worried about whether or not Games Workshop would be upset. It is a fan-made thing that is just really great, and you should try to find out more about it. Another great resource is the Warcry card creator. Cards make games go way faster, but the original cards that came out are no longer up to date, right, because of the Toma Champions. I do think that the cards that came out with the last section of Warcry boxes, I think those are all up to date, but otherwise, the cards are old, they don't have all the fighters, so you can fix that. You can go to the Warcry card creator, you can upload whatever picture you want into this sort of blank section of the screen, and you can copy down the stats you want to put up, and then you can print these out and use them in your games, and it'll make your games go a lot faster. Just a really great sort of resource to have out there. It's also great for homebrew, right? You can, if you have sort of some fighter who you converted and is now your hero, and you have all sorts of narrative built around this fighter that's not an official Warcry piece, you can just build all the stats and print out a card, and that's your hero. That's sort of your perfect person. So just a lot you can do with this site, and I think it's a really great resource for everybody. Another one I've found, I don't actually use this one personally, but for some people I think this will be easier than referencing their books. There's sort of a Warcry rules summary from Order of Gamers. It's just kind of an at-a-glance summary of Warcry's core rules. You can print it out for easy reference. I don't really think of it as a replacement for the core rules. It's missing a few things, but I think it's an amazing aid, especially if you know, don't have a lot of this stuff memorized. It's way easier to find things here than it is by looking up the core rules. Now I want to get into some of the top accessories. These are also things that make games go a lot faster. Combat gauges are built for AOS and 40k, but they're still really useful in Warcry. The reason being they have a 1-inch, a 2-inch, and a 3-inch section. And that's great because of how often it's relevant in Warcry to have, there's 1-inch reach, but then there's also when you have the 2-inch reach fighters where you're constantly trying to measure and make sure they're outside of 1 inches from their opponent, but within 2. I know I mostly play with 2-inch reach warbands, and so I'm constantly having that problem. A combat gauge can really fix that. You can pay $22 for the GW version, or $5 for one from, say, Custom Meeple, which has exactly the same measurements, and it's up to you which you would like to pay. Bendy rulers. You almost never see these anywhere except in these Games Workshop boxes, and I think they're amazing. It's the one sort of accessory that I would never tell anyone to use the non-GW version. If anyone knows of a bendy ruler that is different from this, that's also buyable, let me know in the comments, because I think these are incredible. These come in the base Warcry box sets. You can also get them in AOS and 40k box sets, although those bendy rulers are a lot thicker and a lot worse for Warcry. Basically, measuring tape works fine, but what's amazing with these is you can plot out your fighter's path through terrain, like this, for example. I don't know if the camera's picking that up, it probably isn't, but you can bend the bendy ruler to do the path that your fighter is going to take through terrain, and that just measures it perfectly, as opposed to kind of checking, okay, this section with the thing and then this with the, and then just having to essentially measure 12 times to get the same one measurement that you would get with the bendy ruler. So just in general, I think it's much better. The only exception is shooting warbands are better with measuring tapes, because you can just kind of plop it out to exactly what the range is, and then it's always just line of sight straight anyway, so you don't need the bending. So the only time I would say don't use the bendy ruler is specifically for shooting warbands. Otherwise, if you haven't bought one of the Warcry starter sets, definitely try to find one of these bendy rulers from someone who's gotten multiples of them, because they are the best for actually playing. Finally, I want to talk about dice rollers, or dice holders. And this is also true for kind of token holders as well. There's a million different versions of these on Etsy, and enough people have made different ones for Warcry specifically, that you just get a ton of competing options, and all of them are really good. This one I'm showing is a really solid one. They're all kind of 3D printable. A ton of people are selling them who have just kind of 3D printed dozens of them, and now you can just get them. The token holders are also really nice. So it just sort of organizes your whole board. Some of them, like the one I've shown here, have sort of spots to put your ability cards, things like that. Just a really great way to kind of having everything organized makes things go faster, right? So it just makes your games run a lot more smoothly, and it's absolutely worth doing. Finally, I just want to say thanks. The idea for this video came from my patrons. This is one of the first things that was requested once I got everyone together on the Discord. Just really happy to see that. Can't be thankful enough for the extra perspective that I got from kind of having closer conversations with some of the folks who watch the channel. I think I You know, I talk a lot in these videos about different things in Warcry and kind of create my own jargon sometimes, and it was really good to have the reminder that, you know, it's worth it to kind of stop and explain some of this stuff. So hopefully this video can kind of live on as a reference sheet for anyone who stumbles across and is wondering, you know, what do you mean when you say this? Hopefully I can just always link them back to this glossary video. I'm going to be having some more kind of in-depth list building talks in some videos in the future. I'm probably going to be remaking my sort of starter lists for every warband series that came out last year and is now kind of needing an update and a refresh because of the Tome of Champions. Probably going to be doing that in May, and so, you know, this kind of definitions video I think will be really useful in that context. So thanks to everyone who gave me this idea, and until the next videos, may all your rolls be crits.